Good morning, everybody. My name is Jacqueline Monteith, Science Coach with Frontier School Division. I'm very excited to be here this morning. We are live streaming to you from the Assiniboine Park Zoo. We're in the Journey to Churchill exhibit with the polar bears right behind us, as you can see. We have a great event lined up for you, and I'm going to pass things over to you to give a proper introduction to why we're here this morning.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. Welcome, everybody, to Assiniboine Park Zoo, and thank you so very much for joining us today. A couple of weeks ago in the park, we had an event called the Polar Bear Run. That was for folks who wanted to run here at the park. But what's really exciting is we asked schools to join us and have their own polar bear runs. So we have a few schools with us today who did just that. And we also have some schools from northern Manitoba. And I'd like to welcome you all today and introduce you to a few members of our Polar Bear Rescue Team. The Polar Bear Rescue Team is a group of people who work here at Assiniboine Park Zoo who are involved in everything from research to veterinary care to the daily care that we provide to the polar bears that we are privileged to have here at the zoo. And they are very passionate about polar bears and know a lot about them. So if you have lots of very burning polar bear questions, now is the time. These folks are very smart, and they're going to share everything that they know about polar bears with you today. And I know you're going to ask some really, really smart questions too. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to have a great morning.
Thank you. So just be sure that you are logged into your YouTube account. That way you can access the chat feature, and I'll be asking questions on behalf of your school and your students to our panel of experts. To begin with, we're going to have our panelists do a quick introduction of themselves. Stefan, we'll start with you this morning.
Sounds great. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Dr. Stefan Peterson. I'm the Director of Conservation here at Assiniboine Park Zoo. And so what do I do in that role? It's kind of a really cool dual combination. So I get to do research here at the facility, working with the bears that we care for. But it also means that I get to go up into the field. So I get to go up to Churchill 2 or 3 times a year to study seals that support polar bears and bears and beluga whales. So pretty lucky to have that position.
Yeah, you are. Good morning. My name is Allison Ginsberg. I am a curator of animal care. So in that role, I basically oversee the day-to-day for our bears, as well as the zoological animal caretakers that work with the bears directly. I also oversee all the training and enrichment, or what we call behavioral husbandry, with the animals, especially with the polar bears.
And my name's Chris Enright, and I've been at the zoo here for about 12 years. I've been a veterinarian here, and I'm part of the team that looks after the health and welfare of all the animals here. So from polar bears to tiny little frogs to birds to tigers, we want to make sure what we're doing is we're looking after the needs of those animals so they can help connect people and animals. And that's really a big part of my job, and it's a great one.
Thank you. Great to be introduced to all of you. We have a few schools on board with us. I'd like to give a shout out to Snow Lake. We've got kindergarten and grade 2. We have Oscar Blackburn School here, Strathmillan School, Lynn Lake, Laidlaw, and more. So we're going to get started with some questions right away. The first question that I have is coming from Strathmillan School here in Winnipeg and St. James. And the question is, how long are polar bear teeth?
I can answer that one. And it depends on actually where in the mouth those teeth are. Their biggest teeth are their canine teeth. Polar bears are carnivores. They eat meat, and they really rely on meat. So they have these canine teeth that are meant for grabbing onto animals that they eat. So the teeth you can see, these are the canine teeth. But that's a part of the tooth you can see. Projecting into the skull, there's about the same amount as a root in order to anchor that tooth on so it can hold onto an animal really tightly. So that's the biggest teeth they have. Some of the smallest teeth are the little incisors up at the front, which can help make little more gentle bites. But the biggest teeth are going to be those canine teeth, and they're almost the size of my thumb.
Great, thank you. Next question is coming from Laidlaw School here in Winnipeg as well. how many polar bears do you rescue every year? And the second part is, how do you care for them at the zoo?
Yeah, I can take the first part of that anyways. Sure. So it's really quite variable on how many bears will come down to our facility. So for a long time in Manitoba, we didn't see a lot of polar bear cubs. And then we've seen a bit of a pulse, so more orphan cubs, more human-bear conflict over a few years. And we really don't know what drives those patterns. So we think that something's happening in the wild, that we're seeing more orphan cubs, but we can't really predict why we're seeing or how many we'll see in any given year. So that's kind of how many we see or think we might see in the future. Maybe if you want to talk about the care.
Absolutely. So care obviously is throughout their entire life, but the biggest component when they first come here is to think these are really young bears, and we just have to get them used to a whole new set of what we call stimuli, or things that they're not used to, the sounds, the smells, the sights, being by people and the zookeepers. So really the first step is just to do what we call acclimation, just getting them comfortable, getting them eating, and feeling okay with their new home. And then from there we start to build our relationship and start to work with the animals and get to know each one of them individually and give them the opportunity to get to know each of us individually as well.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from our online audience. Laidlaw School is asking, how long is a polar bear's lifespan? And I've noticed some other schools did ask this as well. Is there a difference between in the zoo or out in the wild as well?
I think you should take Adam.
Well, there certainly is a difference between the zoo and in the wild. In the zoo, we have polar bears that can live to late 20s into their early 30s. We did have a bear here about 8, 9, 10 years ago now, and she lived to be 42, and that's pretty exceptional. In the wild, as bears get in their late teens or early 20s, they start developing arthritis or having broken teeth, and that's the sort of thing in a wild bear that interferes with their ability to find food and to hunt food. In the zoo, if an animal's starting to feel a little bit stiff and sore, we just give them a little bit of extra TLC and help them out with their problems, some medication, some changes to how we manage them, so we can nurse that animal well into its old age, that in the wild, life can be a little bit tougher on those older animals. So they certainly do live a longer life in human care.
Great, thank you. I grew up with Debbie the polar bear and visiting, so that's I'm glad you brought that up. We have Kerrigan from Westland Heights. That's a frontier school all the way up in Lynn Lake, Manitoba. Kerrigan wants to know why female polar bears hibernate.
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. So, because I'm a scientist, we get really particular about our definitions. And so when we talk about hibernation, usually it's reducing that body temperature quite significantly. So polar bears don't actually hibernate. They don't drop that temperature all the way down to be true hibernators. But females do den up in the fall, and that's where they spend the entire winter. So they're sleeping, they're not moving, their body temperature drops a little bit, but not that much. And that's where they have their cub and nurse that cub through the first few months of the year. So it's really this really important time period, not fully hibernation, but close. And it's really a way to keep that cub out of harm's way. So they're protected in that den, they're protected from the elements, they're protected from other things that might want to harm it, and they can grow to be the right size. So in the spring, they can get out on the sea ice and start following mom as she looks for ring seals.
Thank you. Another question, Julia from Laidlaw. How long can polar bears breathe underwater? We see some diving for grapes and other goodies behind you, and they seem to be underwater for quite an extended amount of time.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So the longest polar bear in the wild recorded dive time is about 5 minutes. And so that's about what an average person can probably hold their breath for. Not nearly as long as what seals or what whales can actually hold their breath for. In here, When we're watching a polar bear underwater, it feels like it's a really long time period, but when we actually time it, they usually only hold their breath for about a minute when they're playing around in the pools here.
All right, thank you. Kyler from Strathmillan wants to know if a female bear will ever adopt an orphaned cub.
I'm getting them all. Yeah, so that's another great question. And it's actually one that we have hints at by using genetics. So when researchers are working on wild populations of bears, often they'll take a little sample of tissue, and you can get a genetic fingerprint like on CSI to identify that individual bear. And so researchers, when they capture a mom with cubs, will take those samples, and we know that we have samples where mom is not related to either of the cubs or is not related to one of the cubs. So we know in the wild it happens. We think that it's really a rare event. So probably about less than 5% of the time we'll see a cub being adopted by another female. And it's one of those really cool sorts of things that happens that we would love to know how it happens, because that gives us another tool to keep bears, orphan bears, in the wild, which is something we care about quite a bit here.
Great, thank you. Chris, I'm going to direct this question to you. Chase from Snow Lake is wondering how big polar bears get, and I'd also like to know the difference between at the zoo or in the wild, and if there's a difference in growth.
Sure. Well, it's a very good question, and there's a real difference between male and female bears. The male bears get significantly bigger, both here and in the wild. So our female bears are typically weighing, here at the zoo, between 250 and 300 kilograms. So 550, 650 pound range. Whereas our male bears, they're typically somewhere in the 400 kilogram range, plus or minus a little bit. And that's the same weights that they get in the wild. Here they basically have their free choice of food, so they can grow much quicker than they do in the wild. In the wild, because bears really rely on seals and they rely on sea ice to hunt those seals, they basically take time off from growing when they're not able to eat for those periods of time. Here, where we're able to provide them food through that time, they are able to grow faster, but ultimately they get to the same size as they would in the wild, and they stay there.
Great, thank you. We have a great question. Anna from Strathmillan, and I'm going to start with you, Allison, but this is a question that I'd like everybody to answer. What is the most interesting fact you have learned about polar bears?
Oh, wow. I guess not necessarily fact, but watching their individual personalities come through, or what we call their individualities, just seeing how they respond to one another and to respond to different animal caretakers and the relationship that they have. It's really interesting to see how their personality may jive with a keeper's personality, or may not at all in any capacity. If you have a bear that tends to be really playful and goofy, and an animal caretaker that tends to be a little bit more subdued, they may have challenges interacting with one another. They can still build a relationship, whereas someone that may be a little bit more hyper, I like to call myself a kind of a hyper person. I'm excited, easily excited, may respond better or work better with an animal that is like that as well. And then of course vice versa. So I think that's the interesting thing, is really watching their individual characters come through, and especially given that we have young bears, seeing how they change over time has been really interesting and neat as well.
Very interesting. Thank you. Stefan?
Yeah, so I think my favorite polar bear fact today is going to be, well, one of the things that I'm really interested in is polar bears and seals, and the ways that polar bears are able to hunt for seals. So they really have kind of three different strategies. So they have kind of the sit and wait, and they can be incredibly patient and just hang out for a long time period. They can search using the wind to get the smell of a seal den, and then crash through that den to get the seal inside. And then you can really see how big their brain is and how smart they are when they're doing some of their stalking. So they'll use water, they'll use cracks and leads in the ice, in order to slowly approach where a seal is up on the ice in order to try and get at it. And this takes kind of some really good memorization, so they'll like kind of get the lay of the land, put the head up, but then they can just memorize all the whole path and sink back down into the water and find their way throughout that all from memory to get to where that seal is and hopefully get that seal.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chris?
I think probably my favorite fact is more of an anecdote than a true fact. But as a top predator, polar bears are just so calm, cool, and collected. Both here and in the wild. In the wild, when people are working in and around polar bears, you have to keep an eye for these polar bears that live on the same landscape, and they're curious. They'll approach people, they'll try and figure out what's going on. You might be able to chase them off a little bit, but often they'll just kind of turn around and check you out from a different angle and hope that you don't realize it. And then here, as these cubs are transitioning into human care, they take everything in stride. These cubs are 11 months old. They're babies. They can't survive on their own, but they walk out of their kennel here, they look around, and they just settle right in. And it just seems to be in the nature of polar bears to be the biggest, baddest thing around, and they know it.
They do.
Thank you. I'm going to skip forward a couple questions because this is directly in line with what you just spoke about. Grace from Strathmillan wants to know why polar bears are afraid of walruses, though.
That's a cool question. We know that from some reports that some polar bears will actually try and get walrus. So they usually use a strategy where they rush a whole herd of walrus, and hopefully by the stampeding of it, someone will get injured and then they can get that animal. So I've never seen a walrus. It's on my top list of walrus or things to see in the Arctic, and I haven't seen one yet. But in talking to elders and hunters in the high Arctic and Nunavut, everyone just says, we'll deal with a polar bear, that's fine, but walrus are hands down the baddest guys on the block, or people, or not people, the baddest animals on the block. So there's much more concern, more predictable, and they're just this enormous animal that
Tusks.
has tusks and hide that is not easily kind of harmed. So yeah, they're just tough, and everyone, I think even polar bears, unless they're super, super hungry, have a lot of respect for them.
Great, very interesting. Thank you. Harmony from Westland Heights is wondering how many babies polar bears can have at one time.
Sure. Well, the short answer is it depends. They can have up to 3 cubs in a litter, and how well those cubs survive to adulthood really depends on how fat mom is when she goes into denning, and how much resources she has to support her pregnancy and then the lactation to help those cubs grow up to be adults. So you'll see mums with 1, 2, or 3 cubs, but 3 is pretty well where things max out.
Great, thank you. We have 2 questions that are connected to each other. Allison, I want to direct this towards you because I see you have a pail of goodies over there as well. The questions are: Everett from Strathmillan wants to know what bears could eat if seals go extinct, and Sophia is wondering how polar bears get their blubber. So all about food.
All right. Okay, well, you guys jump in as well. So in the wild, obviously the diet that we feed animals here is a little bit varied from what they may eat in the wild. Typically, they don't get heads of lettuce and things like that. Whoop, throwing gloves. Like that in the wild. But so what we do is we take what they would normally eat, which is obviously, as Dr. Chris mentioned earlier, they're carnivores, so a high amount of protein and meat. We don't feed them seals here, and they don't hunt our seals, although they do like to watch them. If you watch them behind us, you'll see if they are spending a lot of time at the lower glass, they're looking at our harbor seals. They like to play back and forth with one another. So what we do is we really look at what are the needs for the animals here, and obviously they do need a high amount of protein. So we have this specialized meat here that we roll into little meatballs and feed to the animals. We also feed them a glove. I'm going to throw a glove on right now, real quickly. Just so I don't have to wash my hands right away. We also feed them fish, so we give them a lot of variety. This is capelin and herring. They can get a lot of water moisture from this as well. They do drink water, of course, and we do provide them fresh water daily, but they can get water nutrients as well. A polar bear chow. Just gonna throw it at Chris. So see all that. And then, like we said, we do feed them also produce as well. This is more, they really just enjoy it. It does give water content, but it's obviously not a high source of fat or caloric intake. Every single one of our bears, this is actually one of their favorite foods, surprisingly, is romaine lettuce. And if you may not see any more floating in the pool because they've eaten it all, but this is one of their hands down favorite things to eat. Their diets will vary depending on whether it's summer or winter. They tend to eat a lot more in the winter, of course. In the summer, it's warmer, they're not as interested, so this actually goes a lot farther for us sometimes.
Great, thank you. That leads into a next question. Jamal from Westland Heights wants to know where polar bears do live in the summer. And of course, continue on if you have more to add about their diet as well.
Yeah, I think, so part of the last question was about what happens if seals disappear. And so that's one of the questions that we really are very interested in, because ring seals especially play such a big part of polar bear diet. So that's one of the reasons we're really concerned about polar bears is as we lose sea ice, we'll still have seals. So we might have harbor seals, we might have harp seals coming into the same area, but polar bears need that ice to get onto the bay, onto the ocean to actually hunt those seals. And so we think, and we're pretty sure, that even though polar bears can eat some other things, so they can eat, goose eggs or some of these other things that they find on land, that seal food source is critical. And if they can't access those seals, we're going to see really big drops in those population numbers. So that's kind of part of the concern we have for polar bears. And I've forgotten the second question.
Where they live in summer.
Oh, yeah. So where they live in summer also varies across the range. So polar bears, live over the entire Arctic area. So that includes way far in the north in Canada where there's ice all year round, all the way to south in Hudson's Bay where ice all melts during the summer. So in the summer, all those polar bears are off on shore, hanging out, waiting for the sea ice to form. But as you go further north, bears can spend more time throughout the year and more time in the summer on ice, on the water, still trying to hunt seals. So it really depends on where those bears are hanging out.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Strathmillan. Mrs. McLean Pila wants to know what is their favorite enrichment toy at the zoo?
Their favorite enrichment? Well, that again varies from bear to bear. Just like people or kids, we all have different things that we enjoy interacting with. A lot of them really we have big bears. So all the enrichment that we do is really to help stimulate natural behavior. We want to see it eliciting behavior that they would naturally do in the wild and has a purpose behind it as opposed to just putting a toy in there. One of the biggest things that we see is we put in huge barrels and they will often crush them. And it's actually very similar to behavior to what Dr. Stefan was talking about earlier about breaking the sea ice. So we see them actually pouncing on those barrels, and it's very similar to what they would be doing in order to break the ice. They'll play with different types of balls and things in the water. So it really just depends on the animal, what their favorite thing is, and it varies also from day to day and their own mood that moment.
Great, thank you. I do see you have an artifact in front of you.
I do.
With the red and white tip. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So this is called a target pole. So all the behaviors that we condition or train here, first off, everything is what we call positive reinforcement based, meaning that we simply look and train behaviors that we want the animals to repeat, and then we reinforce it in different ways. So typically either with food or a toy, our praise, and any behavior that we don't want repeated, we just simply ignore and move on. So it's all what we call positive reinforcement based. So in order for us to get a really good look at their bodies, in order for us to be able to take medical samples or research samples, we want to be able to look into their mouths. We want them to be able to give us their sides so we can look at their sides, their paws, get them to stand up so we can actually see their full belly. So it's kind of hard sometimes. They're really big animals. 5'6", so I'm kind of tall, but I can't reach as tall as a bear. So I can take a target pole and I can actually put it up over my head, and that way I can actually train the bear to target their nose to the top of this tip of this target pole. And that way I can move them around in different locations in order to be able to see those different body parts. Training is extremely important for the care and welfare of the animals, not only for us to be able to obtain voluntary samples, but as we talked about, these are very intelligent animals, big brains, so constantly stimulating them in their environment by learning, just as how humans always need to be learning and actively engaging their brains. It's the same thing for these animals.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Ariel and Gunnar from Snow Lake. They want to know how fast and long a polar bear can both run and swim.
I can't remember how fast they can run. I know it is faster than a human, so don't try and outrun a polar bear. But if you're from the north, you probably know that already without me telling. They can swim for really long distances. They're not fast swimmers, so I think it's about 4 kilometers an hour. But their record for the distance that a polar bear has swimmed, gone in the water without
See, you always
coming
need to
up.
be activating the brain.
Yeah, was around 8 or 9 days straight swimming over about 700 kilometers. So a really long distance. So bears are really comfortable in the water. They can swim, they can move around, they can go long distances. Because the water is so cold and they're not eating anything, they definitely lose energy and lose fat while they're doing that. But they're really great in the water. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Charlie from Laidlaw wants to know if a polar bear's tongue and skin are purple, and if so, why are they that color?
Sounds like a question for you.
Well, polar bear tongue is kind of a dark purple, almost black in color. And truth to tell, I haven't seen any clear evidence as to why the tongue is pigmented like that as opposed to a lighter pink. The skin of a polar bear is relatively dark in color. Not quite a jet black, but gray. Yeah, probably a dark gray.
Dark gray.
I would best describe it
Charcoal.
as. Under that white fur. And I imagine, and I'm sure the science moves on this, it's to help keep heat in. As the heat hits that dark skin, it just helps keep the bear warm in the cold weather.
Yeah, and I don't know if we really know why the tongue is. It's probably that, I'm going to bring it back to genetics. It's probably that there's a gene that turns on for skin and outside surfaces to be dark, and it just keeps going for the tongue and inside the mouth as well. And there's several other bears that all have that black tongue as well. So different species of bears sometimes have that as well. But I'm not sure if there's a benefit to that or if it's just, a gene gets turned on and everything that you're covered in gets a little bit of pigment.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question here from, I'm just trying to find it again, Liam, from Strathmillan. He wants to know how you decide which bears to rescue or why.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so it's one of the things that we do is really work with the province. And so the province is their job, or one of the roles that they have, is to manage the wildlife in Manitoba. And so we work with the province, and our role really starts after the decision's been made on whether a bear gets rescued or not. So even though we have lots of expertise and we provide advice to the province, it's the province that's making those first decisions. And what they're looking at is this an orphan cub? And we know that orphan cubs under a certain age, so when they're about 11 months old is when we see them. we know that they're not going to survive. Their chance of survival is 100% probably. Potentially if they get adopted, it's not 100%, but for 99% of all the bears that are orphans, they're just going to die. So if it's an orphan cub, and it needs to be an orphan cub that's around where humans are. So they're not going to fly out into the woods to try and find orphan cubs. They have to be around where people are. And what we've seen is kind of a change. So really, it's bears that are going to interact with people are the ones that are candidates to be rescued. And then the other case, and we have one bear here that falls into that, is if there was a bear that's a problem bear, or a bear that gets into problems, because he's probably not a problem bear as much as bad circumstance. So in that case, normally that bear would have to be euthanized, and we really don't, in the province, want to be killing bears, and so they'll take that bear. So Storm is a case where he got into trouble in Churchill, and so that made him a candidate to come down to our facility. Yeah.
Okay, and another part to that question, how do you actually get the bears to the zoo? This is coming from Jaden at Strathmillan.
Oh, that's probably a great Chris question.
Sure, that is a good question. So, as these bears are identified by the Provincial Wildlife Ministry, Sustainable Development, they bring that bear into human care and into a facility in Churchill or elsewhere in the north in Manitoba. And we get the call to come out and take part in the process. So we come up very quickly, usually within a couple of days, and the first thing we do is we check out the health of that animal. We want to make sure that cub is healthy enough to travel and that we're not putting that cub at any risk of any complications. So every bear, we do a physical exam, and we bring things to help that bear get better if that bear is sick for whatever reason. And we make sure that bear's a good candidate. And once that happens, we put the bear in a big, robust, not quite a dog crate, much more robust than that, and we fly the bear down to Winnipeg. And so we work very closely with some of the airlines that do provide service to the north, and we bring those bears down to Winnipeg, and typically the same day that they're getting their physical exam and making sure they're healthy, by that night they're showing up in Winnipeg at our transition center here at the Leatherdale International Polar Bear Conservation Center.
So what I'm hearing is that when I fly north, there's a chance I'm going to be flying back with a polar bear on the plane.
Right next to you in the seat.
As long as there's a chance,
Yeah, it's usually
right?
a charter flight, yeah.
Shanice from Westland Heights wants to know why polar bears are white.
That's a good question. So polar bears are white largely because that's the perfect camouflage for being out on the sea ice. So when they're out trying to hunt seals, the whole landscape is largely white. And so if you don't want your seals to know that you're there, white is the perfect color for that. And we see that in a number of things. Number of Arctic species all have that white coloration. So, ring seal pups, harp seal pups, they're white, so they're camouflaged. Polar bears, camouflaged again, but this time throughout their whole life. Arctic foxes are another one, nice and white. Some of the caribou that are in the high Arctic tend to be a lot more white. So lots of things in the Arctic are really adapted to blending into that landscape by being white.
Great, thank you. I have a 3-part question, so let me know if there's any pieces that you're unsure of. So Seth from Snow Lake is wondering how often polar bears harm people. Cadence from Strathmillan wants to know if bears are afraid of people. And Sophia would like to know why adult male bears will attack baby bears. So that's the theme of this question, is attacking.
Yeah, I can start, and then maybe people can chime in. Bears are really smart, and they're always looking for an opportunity to get another meal. And that's really what brings them into conflict with people. So they're, as Chris had mentioned, they know that they're the baddest on the block, so they don't have a lot of fear. And they're always looking for that meal, so they're always going to be pushing the boundaries on where they can learn something new or find a new meal, and that brings them into conflict with people. We do see some conflict, but compared to the number of people that are injured by black bears and grizzly bears, polar bears are really, really low. We've had, last year we had a couple really horrible events happen, but over the course of history, polar bears tend not to be the ones that are attacking people. They can learn quite a bit, so they can learn to be afraid of people. So lots of bears, if they've had negative interactions with people in the past, will avoid people in the future, and that's why in Churchill, the polar bear alert team spends time hazing animals out of the town, so they want to give them a negative experience around kind of people in town so that they move on and don't spend some time with them. And I can't remember the last question.
Why adult male bears will attack baby bears.
Oh, yeah. So adult male bears, but also subadult male bears can be a risk for those younger cubs, and we think it's probably they're looking for a meal. So it's really driven by hunger more than anything. In other animals, so in, say, groups of lions, sometimes males will kill cubs in order to kind of take over a pack and get rid of their competitors' genes so they can replace their own genes. But we don't think that's happening in polar bears. We think it's really driven by food and food motivation.
I was just going to add to the beginning part of the question. I think it's a wonderful thing. We should get out in nature and we should see animals in the wild, but at the same point, we have to respect that we're in their environment. So in anything, if you're in the Arctic, if you're in the ocean, if you're in the forest, remembering that this is that animal's home. And so it's good to always have a healthy respect for those animals. It's amazing to learn how they live in their area and their importance within that specific area that they call home, whether it's the forest and their role or in the ocean. But remembering that when we're encountering these animals in the wild, it's their home and their area that we're actually in. So understanding the animal and their role in that and how to protect ourselves and take care of that so that we're not directly impacting that animal in any capacity.
Great, thank you. Kaylee from Westland Heights wants to know if they stay more on land or more on water.
Yep, sure. So again, polar bears are they're really adapted for life on the ocean, and really that's life on the sea ice on top of the ocean. So we think of polar bears as a marine mammal similar to seals and whales because they're spending so much time out on the ocean. In southern Hudson's Bay, because we have all that sea ice melt during the summer, they do spend a significant amount of time on land, but we still don't really think of them as a terrestrial predator because they're just hanging out, biding time before they can get back out onto the ocean and out onto the sea ice to do what they do best.
Okay, thank you. Henry from Laidlaw wants to know how long has the longest polar bear has lived. Sorry, that's phrased. I'll rephrase. Henry from Laidlaw wants to know how long the polar bear has lived. And we talked about here at the zoo being 42 years, if you know of any bears who have lived longer.
There was one instance that we know of a bear living longer than the 42-year-old bear we had here. So 43 is actually the longest that a polar bear has been known to live.
Okay, good, thank you. Mr. Campbell from Westland Heights wants to know all about how climate change has affected polar bears. So this is a big question. Feel free to pitch in at any capacity, all three of you.
Yeah. Do you want me to start?
You kick it off.
So I'll start and talk a little bit about maybe climate change and the habitat, and then maybe someone else can talk about why that habitat is really important for polar bears. So we mentioned that polar bears are Arctic species. They're adapted to really being out on the sea ice. And what we're seeing with the changes in climate as the temperature of the Earth increases, we're seeing that ice melt in different ways. So in the high Arctic, we're seeing it as ice loss. So a lot of times you'll hear about, the Arctic Ocean and how that sea ice is getting smaller and smaller. So it's really a loss of that sea ice that's important for polar bears. In Hudson's Bay, we're not seeing that loss of sea ice because we lose it every year normally. And what we're seeing is that ice melts sooner in the spring and freezes later in the fall. So we end up with kind of a shortening of the ice season and a lengthening of that open water season. Maybe someone else wants to talk about why that's important.
Yeah.
Sure. I can jump in because it actually dovetails into a question I had before. So if those bears wholly rely on sea ice to hunt their seals, and the days are getting shorter at the front end and at the back end that they have ice on the ocean to hunt seals, they're not able to put on as much fat as they would if they had longer time. And especially in the case of the female bears, if they don't put on enough fat, they're not able to raise as many young animals, their babies, as well as if they had put on lots of fat reserves. So those effects are being seen in polar bears today in some parts of their range, and it's the effects of females not being able to put on as much fat, not being able to raise as much young, so the population starting to have the effects of fewer young animals coming into the population in order to maintain that population into the future. So that direct effect of climate change and sea ice and polar bear populations are what we're seeing now, and really why we have polar bears in the zoo. Because why those animals are in the zoo is to lead a good life in human care that otherwise they weren't able to have in the wild, but also to tell the story of polar bears to the people here, the people out there on the live stream today, in order to connect people with animals and change their behavior in order to try to keep polar bears in the wild, in Manitoba and elsewhere, in the next 50 and 100 years.
I think polar bears are really kind of one of the keystone animals that really depicts the what's happening with climate change. They're the ones that rely mostly. I mean, obviously other animals are affected as well, but I think their story is really one of the biggest indicators that there is a big challenge and change that's occurring with climate change, and that we need to start directing our efforts in order to try and slow that down.
Great, thank you. Anything else to add? I know this is such a huge topic, but
We could talk all
such
day
a
on just
most
that.
important topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think any kind of discussion of climate change probably needs to have a little bit of, it is this big topic and it's huge and it can feel really overwhelming. But there's still lots of things that all of us can be doing to turn the tide, to work together in order to make it a smaller, more manageable problem that we can all be working together to help ourselves, but also to help polar bears. So don't get overwhelmed or throw up your arms and walk away from the problem. We can all be doing little things that build up to big things, and we can all be influencing kind of government, your parents, your teachers, in all sorts of great ways for the
Classmates.
environment and for polar bears.
Yep.
Great, thank you so much. And that's a great point about what we can do at the local level, which is the whole point of why we're here and doing the run and International Polar Bear Day awareness and everything connected to why we're here today. Sophia from Strathmillan wants to know, how do females make their dens?
Yeah, so we see them trying to excavate different sorts of things here in the exhibits that we have, the habitats that we have. But basically, there's a couple different ways. So in Western Hudson's Bay, along the Manitoba coast, there's lots of peat bogs along rivers and in the tundra. So they'll dig into that peat in amongst the roots of spruce trees, and they'll hang out there. And then when the snow drifts over them in the winter, they'll dig out into that snowdrift. But if you're in the high Arctic, there's just snowdrifts. So they'll dig right into the snowdrift, and then they're usually on the side of the hill that collects more snow. So as the snow collects during that winter, they'll dig out into that hard-packed snow. They don't really have the best claws for digging, but they've got big paws, so they're able to excavate pretty efficiently in a den.
Great, thank you. I'm just looking ahead. I'm skipping ahead a little bit here in the online questions that are coming up because Donald from Westland Heights has a very great joke to share with you. What's a polar bear's favorite drink?
Polar bear's favorite drink?
An ice cap.
Oh, very nice.
Good one, Donald. Nice. So we only have maybe 5 to 8 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions that are still coming in.
Great.
So what I would like to do is just kind of condense some of the questions that are coming in from our online audience and just do a series of short answers. So first question for short answers is coming from Strathmillan. Why do polar bears have hollow hair?
So it's a question that researchers have kind of been trying to figure out. So there's probably a few reasons. Probably adds to their buoyancy. Most of their kind of floatiness in the water is due to a big fat blubber layer, but that hair, hollow hair probably helps with that. And it probably also helps with insulation. So it's like having little kind of, not down, but little compartments of air all over your body to give you a little bit more insulation.
Great, thank you. A couple that we've already talked about previously. This one, Labika from Laidlaw wants to know, what is a polar bear's life cycle?
A short answer for a life cycle?
Yeah, maybe that's not such a short answer.
So short answer would be females in the fall will go into dens, have a baby in the winter, so November-ish, November, December. I come out on the ice in the spring, so this time of year, hunt seals, and then all get pushed back onto land in the fall, and then repeat that process. If you're a male, you don't spend time in the den, you're out roaming around hunting, and then coming back and just hanging out for the rest of the summer. And I guess breeding season is in the spring, so there's that. That's a very disjointed cycle of polar bears.
Great, thank you. How tall are bears at the zoo compared to in the wild?
Oh, my. Go ahead.
Well, they do get the same size as in the wild, so the bears here and the bears in the wild do end up at the same height, and males are significantly taller as well as heavier than the females. Standing on 4 feet, a female's probably
Meter and a half.
meter and a half, sort of somewhere in my stomach to chest area, and male is going to be a little bit more than that, probably carrying his head a little bit higher, my chest shoulder area.
And how about if they're on 2 feet?
Huge.
Considerably taller.
Yeah, probably a couple meters.
Oh, yeah.
If you're standing with a pole
Oh, yeah.
above it, yeah. Probably a couple meters.
And even then, sometimes it's standing on a chair to stand on a pole.
Yeah, thank you. Another question. I believe you touched on this when talking about air insulation in their fur, but the question is, why don't polar bears get cold?
So they probably do get cold, but it's probably not until it's like minus 50. And when that happens, we see them kind of curling up under a snowdrift, and then the snow just drifts right over them, and they're insulated. But yeah, they're not really getting cold, and it's largely because they've just got 2 inches of insulative blubber over top of them, and then dense underfur and long guard hairs all working together to keep them nice and toasty.
They are perfectly adapted to the environment that they live in.
Yeah.
Every body part on them is suited for their environment. The small ears, the small tail, the hair, as we talked about, everything works in conjunction in order for them to be able to retain heat in their bodies.
Great, thank you.
Everybody's cold and minus 50. I mean.
This is going to be maybe a directional question, not something we can necessarily answer today for all three of you. Hayden from Strathmillan wants to know what type of research they have done on polar bears. So what we could do is possibly direct the classes to research that's been done or different projects that you're all working on.
Sure, Mike. So I don't know what's on our website for projects that we've done, but we do a few little projects with the animals that we have in our care. So currently, maybe on the bears behind us, you might see a black dot on some of them. So we're working with another set of researchers that are looking at how hair grows. We're doing it becoming polar bear beauticians, I think was the word that got tossed
No
around.
gray hair here.
Yeah. So we dye a spot with hair dye, and then we're watching how fast that hair grows in and measuring that growth, and that'll help researchers in the wild. Researchers in the wild? Researchers doing research in the wild. Not wild researchers. They're
Well, maybe
they're
they
kind of
will.
wild.
Similar, very similar. Okay, go ahead. Allison or Chris, yeah. Anything that you'd like to point out, research or project or anything else?
Yeah, so my role, I guess, is to help facilitate the research projects in order to be able to, if the bear who has the spot maybe on their shoulder or on their hip lines up to that spot, and then that way we can actually take measurements to see. So our job is to help facilitate the research projects and also doing observations on our animals so that we can understand bear behavior and how animals interact with one another and how they interact with their environment. Even though obviously this is a different environment than they live in the wild, they still exhibit a lot of the same behaviors. So.
Great. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, on the veterinary side of things, we're obviously interested in the health of all of the bears in our care. So we certainly do that not as a research project, but just as a health promotion activity for the animals here. So we might do a physical exam, we might obtain a blood sample in order to look at how organs are functioning. And often when we're doing that sort of thing, we'll be collecting samples for some of our collaborators, both within the zoo and beyond, in order to, our focus is health, but take part in some of those other research projects that might need a swab from inside the mouth or a blood sample to look for a certain hormone or chemical in the body. So we certainly work closely with those other departments in order to collect those samples and look after our bears.
Great, thank you.
We all have to work together to make sure that we're giving the best in care and welfare for the animals.
Excellent, as it should be, yes.
Absolutely.
So we're just about out of time here. We unfortunately have probably a good 20 questions that we're not getting to online, which is a great sign that our schools are so interested in finding out this information.
Great job, guys.
So to wrap up for the day, though, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity, if there's any artifacts that you want to point out that we didn't get to, funny stories, or any information that we didn't address today. So Chris, we'll start with you for this.
Okay. Well, off the top of my head, I'm afraid I don't have any funny stories. But I think the biggest thing for me is making sure that these animals that are in our care are looked after really well. And we've got a great team both around the table and within the zoo and the zoo community that does look after those bears. And what that helps us accomplish is things like this, is connecting people and animals. That's why we're all here in the zoo. That's why these animals are here in the zoo. And thank you all for taking part in that, because we absolutely feel it's important to care about nature, care about animals, and help do what we can to keep polar bears in Manitoba.
Thank you. As you were speaking, you had 3 polar bears in a fight over here, in a play fight.
I understand the distraction.
Yeah. Allison, go ahead.
I don't know if I have a specific funny story, but just in general, watching these animals, they're really kind of, at least our bears are kind of goofy in the way that they interact with each other, as you can see behind. We have actually, these are three of our youngest males, Nanook, Siku, and Baffin. And so watching them, what we call spar, which is a very natural behavior, and interact with each other, that actually just is funny in general, because you'll see them sometimes on their hill and all three of them will just slide down the hill and fall in the water, or so just watching them be playful and interacting with each other, I literally can watch them all day. Maybe not when they're sleeping, that's kind of boring, but when they're playing with one another, because they're how they interact, and they're so big, but they could be so gentle with one another as well, but not all the time. Sometimes they do get kind of rough, but it's all play, and it's actually all part of a learning process, especially for young males. But so just watching them is really fun. I just love being able to see them interact.
Thank you so much. Stefan?
Yeah, so I think I just want to say thank you very much for being interested in polar bears and caring about polar bears and joining us for the live stream. I've been watching in the reflection bears behind us, so I'm sure that you didn't hear a word we said and you were just staring at bears, but I'm kind of used to it, so I'm okay with that. So yeah, just thanks for being interested and
Thank
caring
you.
for polar bears.
Yeah.
And one last question, where can our schools go to find further information on the questions that didn't get answered today?
That is a great question.
Is that a question
and
for you?
maybe Laura.
All right.
So obviously, we knew you were going to have great questions, and we just don't have enough time to answer them all. But if you go to our website, and specifically there's a section about the Polar Bear Run and the school program, there's a list there of a bunch of really great resources that you can find online. Websites that have all kinds of good information about polar bears and sea ice and climate change. And, you know, maybe with Jacqueline, we can also arrange to get you some answers to some of those questions that we didn't get to today. So we'll work on that. And, you know, we're always happy to answer those questions. So thanks, everybody. These were really smart questions. I knew you were going to have smart questions. Yeah.
I'd like to give a big thank you to our audience, our virtual audience, our schools who have participated today. Also to Assiniboine Park Zoo, to our panel of experts, and especially to Jeff and Chris who are here working behind the scenes from our Frontier School Division Technology Department, Right Click, who made all of this possible as well. Again, like you said, we can compile the questions and get answers to you if they didn't get answered here yet today. So look forward to that in the next little while.